Yes, dear viewers, how are you? Long time. Uh, Today there's something I want to share with you about the science we teach. And before I share with you what I want to share with you, as teachers, this is just an advice, a piece of advice. As teachers of science, fellow colleagues, it's very good before you teach your class, before you teach your lesson, when you're smart. The way you see I'm dressed, I'm smart. I'm not saying that you should dress like the way I've dressed up, but at least try to be smart. Why? When you teach your class, when you are smart, there is an image it creates in your learners. It makes learners to like the subject that you teach them. And the moment they like the science you teach them, then there are so many benefits, there are chances that they are likely to understand. There is also a likelihood that they are going to perform well in end of term, in end of year assessment. So, without wasting time, let's quickly jump into what I want us to look at. In P3, we teach air and we teach properties of air. So today, there is a certain property of air I want us to look at, but in a practical way. You know, teaching science is not telling science. We are supposed to teach science using the practical approach. I think you know the benefits of teaching science practically. Dear teacher, dear viewer, just I request you to pay attention and you observe what I'm going to do. First of all, this is a balloon, as you can see. This is a glass with no water, and this is a book, a counter book. So the property I want us to look at is the property of air can be compressed. But I told you that sometimes as teachers of science, there is a weakness that we are still having when we are teaching these learners scientific concept. Something that affects their understanding, something that affects the way they grasp the scientific concepts, and something that will even affect the way they will attempt the assessment tests that you will give them at the end of the lesson, or at the end of the term, or even at the end of the year. When you check in our curriculum, there are two competencies: language competencies and subject competencies. Sometimes we neglect language competencies and we focus our attention on subject competencies, and that is wrong. And that's why sometimes, for example, when we ask these learners questions from what we have taught them, sometimes it becomes hard for them when they are writing or expressing their answers. Why? Because when we are teaching, we normally focus our attention on subject competencies, in other words, on giving knowledge, then we leave behind what we call language competencies. So what is my advice as a fellow teacher who teaches science? When you are going to handle properties of air, you are supposed to define or to give the meaning of the phrase properties of air. Properties of air are characteristics, are qualities that describe how air behaves. They are qualities or characteristics that define what air is. They are characteristics that describe what air can do. And that's where you are supposed to begin from, by explaining to the learners the meaning of the phrase properties of air. Then from there, let's quickly jump into this property. And this property is nothing other than air can be compressed. So air can be compressed. When you are going to teach that property, you are supposed to have the materials, help learners identify the materials you are going to use. In other words, sometimes what they call apparatus at advanced level. But at primary, you can say materials, we can say items. For this case, we can see this is a balloon, this is a glass, an empty glass, and this is also a counter book. These are the materials that we are going to use in our experiment. Mind you, we are going to demonstrate the experiment of air can be compressed. So this is an empty balloon, as you can see, and I'm going to fill it with air. But before I fill it with air, as you can see, this balloon is small, meaning that it has a small space. Then the air I'm filling in will occupy this space, meaning that I'm compressing this air. I'm forcing this air from my lungs to enter this balloon, meaning that compress means to squeeze air to enter a small space. Because this air is entering a small space inside the balloon, it will be squeezed. Its volume will become smaller. I mean the volume of air. So air can be compressed, or when we are compressing air, we are reducing the volume of air. The air that is entering this balloon is being squeezed, is being forced to occupy a small space. Which small space is the space inside the balloon? Let's watch. I think you have seen the air that has entered this balloon has been compressed. It has been squeezed to occupy a smaller space. So that's what we call air can be compressed. But before we move any further, there are other properties of air that can apply to this situation that I'm just trying to demonstrate. What are these two other properties? First of all, air exerts pressure can apply. Also, air occupies space can also apply, because as you can see, before there was nothing, but after filling the balloon with air, then the size of the balloon has become bigger, meaning that inside air is occupying space. But my emphasis in this video is air can be compressed. First of all, I've said that when you are blowing air into this balloon, you are forcing this air which is coming from the lungs, to occupy this space which was inside the balloon, meaning that you are trying to reduce the volume of this air that is entering. You are trying to squeeze the volume of this air. And another thing, or another fact that we are supposed to know, or we are supposed to get as teachers, when you reduce the volume of air, that air becomes denser. But before I move any further, you are supposed to explain the importance of the materials or the items you have used in the experiment. In other words, what is the importance, for example, of the balloon in this experiment? what is the importance of the air in this experiment, and other materials that I'm going to use. And sometimes that is the weakness we do have as teachers of science when we are teaching science using what we call experimentation or demonstration. Sometimes we forget to help learners get to know the importance or the purpose of the materials we have used in the experiment or during the experiment. So if I, for example, I press this balloon here and I press this glass and I press like this, you can see this balloon is trying to become flat, meaning that the air which is inside is being squeezed. And it squeeze means to compress. To compress air means that we are forcing this air which was inside the balloon to occupy a smaller space. That's why when you keep on pushing, for example, pressing this glass, then this balloon will burst. Why? Because the air which was inside will be squeezed to occupy a smaller volume, and yet the balloon may not expand. And because of the pressure that has been exerted on that air which is inside the balloon, it will force the balloon to pop or to burst. If, for example, I bring this book and I press it still on top of this balloon which was filled with air, then I press like this, or even when I bring like a stone, I'm also compressing air. That is what we are supposed to do as teachers of science, to help these learners understand the science we teach them, than just teaching theoretically, just making them to memorize something that will encourage cram work, something that is against a competence-based curriculum. Meaning that during an experiment like this one, maybe after demonstrating or giving learners the theory part of it, you are supposed maybe to group your learners, or if you have enough materials, they can remain in their seats or their places, and you guide them to perform a similar experiment. And that is what a competence-based curriculum is all about. It is child-centered. It emphasizes what learners can do than what they can memorize. Then still on the property of air can be compressed, the last part of it which we don't normally teach as teachers is the application part of it. The science we teach these learners, we are supposed to help these learners to see the relevance of what we teach them, to see how they can apply, for example, this property of air in their real life, in the real world. And that is what we call functional science, helping learners to apply the science we teach them in real life, in the real world. Helping these learners to know that the property that we have learned, which is air can be compressed, we can use it to solve our problems in our daily life. We can apply this science in day-to-day life. And that is what a competence-based curriculum emphasizes when we are teaching science. That's what we are supposed to do actually. Now, the last part of this air can be compressed is the daily applications. In other words, they can ask learners that give 2 ways in which the property of air can be compressed is important to people or is important in our daily life. So the first daily application or one situation where this property can be applied. One is filling balloons, filling tires, filling or inflating tires, inflating balls, inflating balloons. That is one daily application. If they want, they can also make set an item or a question that is trying to check whether learners can apply the knowledge they acquired during the lesson of air can be compressed. They can say, give one way in which the property of air can be compressed is important or can be important to school children. And we know that school children, they play with balloons or they like balloons. So you can say it helps school children to inflate balloons or even to inflate balloons, yes, or to fill balloons with air. Another application of air can be compressed. It helps or it is used in spraying, for example, spraying agrochemicals, spraying insecticides, spraying perfumes, spraying paint, like for the case of painters, we are applying the property of air can be compressed. It can also be used in air conditioners. It can be used in oxygen cylinders. In other words, in hospitals, the patients can get oxygen from oxygen cylinders using the property of air can be compressed. The same property of air can be compressed. It also helps fire extinguisher, or it helps fire extinguisher to put out fire. In other words, when we are using fire extinguisher, we are also using the science of air can be compressed. The property of air can be compressed can also be used in air brakes, as I can say. In other words, in car brakes, it helps cars to brake. There are those cars that use air to brake, like buses, like trucks, and that's why when they apply or they step on their brakes, you hear them making a funny sound like psst, 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 psst. So meaning that those brakes of vehicles or air brakes of vehicles of buses and trucks, they are also using or they also use the property of air can be compressed. So I think, dear teachers, as I wind up, you have seen what we mean by exhaustive teaching. Teaching in detail than just mentioning the property of air can be compressed and you leave it at that. We must teach in detail. We must teach exhaustively. We must help these learners apply the knowledge we give them or get to understand how they can apply the science that we teach them in their daily life outside the school in solving their daily problems. The moment you do that, that's what we call complete teaching, exhaustive teaching, extensive teaching. And that is the way to go. As I wind up, don't forget to follow me, subscribe to my YouTube channel, so as you keep on watching similar videos. You can also watch my TikTok channel or page and you will learn a lot. I'm waiting for you in the comment section where you need me to touch, where that question you want me to answer. We move together and we serve our nation. See you.